Two-Gun Crowley, Part 1. The Rise of a Killer in Broad Daylight. In the early 1930s, New York City was a place caught between grit and glamour. Prohibition was still the law, gangsters had become folk heroes, and the police force was engaged in a constant battle for control of the streets. Amidst this chaos, a young man would emerge from obscurity and become one of the most feared and sensationalized criminals in the city's history. His name was Francis Crowley, but the press would come to call him Two-Gun Crowley, a nickname that would live in infamy. Francis Crowley was born in 1912 in New York. His life began with abandonment. His father left before he was old enough to speak. Raised by a single mother in a city that offered few chances and even fewer second ones, Francis grew up feeling like the world was already against him. By the time he was a teenager, the streets had become his teacher. He was small, sharp-eyed, angry, and by 16, he'd already been arrested multiple times for theft, assault, and carrying illegal firearms. But what separated Crowley from other street kids wasn't just his defiance, it was his willingness to use violence as his first language. The transformation from troubled youth to feared criminal happened fast. In early 1931, Crowley found himself caught in a spiral of escalating crimes. He wasn't content to simply steal, he wanted to be feared, to be untouchable. In one chilling incident that February, two New York City detectives approached a parked car in which Crowley and two accomplices were sitting. Without hesitation, Crowley fired. One of the officers, 28-year-old Frederick Hirsch, was killed instantly. The other barely survived. What should have been a routine check had become a cold-blooded execution. The city erupted. Newspapers printed Crowley's face on front pages. Police launched a manhunt with orders to bring him in, dead or alive. But Crowley didn't run and hide. Instead, he went on the offensive. He traveled upstate, robbing stores and banks, shooting anyone who got in his way. At one point, when cornered by police in a stolen car, he opened fire and managed to escape through a barrage of bullets. Each encounter left the city more terrified and more obsessed. It was around this time that the name Two-Gun Crowley stuck. He was never seen without two pistols, one strapped to each side, and was known to fire both at once in a chaotic but deadly display. The public, already in love with gangster mythology thanks to the likes of Al Capone and John Dillinger, became fascinated by the young outlaw. But Crowley wasn't a calculating mastermind or a criminal businessman. He was pure chaos, reckless, emotional, and increasingly desperate. As the manhunt intensified, Crowley found a brief refuge in the Bronx, staying with his 16-year-old girlfriend, Helen Walsh. The apartment was modest. The plan was simple: lay low, stay hidden, wait for the storm to pass. But Crowley's notoriety had grown too large. Police tracked him down within days. What happened next would turn him from a dangerous criminal into a national spectacle, a moment of violence so dramatic that it would be talked about for generations. The final hours of a deadly legend. By May of 1931, the name Francis Two-Gun Crowley had become a symbol of terror in New York. No longer just a teenage outlaw, he was now the focus of a citywide manhunt, headlining newspapers and whispered about in bars, precincts, and households alike. The public couldn't get enough of the story. A handsome boy with cold eyes and twin pistols, firing at police like a character out of a gangster film. But beneath the headlines, reality was closing in. After a series of violent encounters and near escapes, Crowley returned to New York City, seeking shelter with his 16-year-old girlfriend, Helen Walsh. The two took refuge in a fifth-floor apartment on West 91st Street in the Bronx. It was a modest flat, tucked away in a quiet building, but to the police, it was the end of the line. Acting on a tip, officers surrounded the building on the evening of May 7th. They came in force, over 300 officers in trench coats, plainclothes detectives, sharpshooters on rooftops, and patrolmen lining the street. Some were armed with rifles. Others carried tear gas and submachine guns. It was a siege. Inside the apartment, Crowley refused to surrender. As officers attempted to breach the building, he opened fire from the window, triggering one of the most dramatic gun battles in New York history. For nearly 2 hours, bullets tore through plaster and brick. Gunfire echoed down the block as Crowley, wounded in the arm and chest, fought back with both pistols from behind overturned furniture. From the sidewalk, thousands of New Yorkers gathered to watch. What they saw was not just a criminal shootout, but a full-scale urban war being led by a teenager who refused to give in. Eventually, Police filled the apartment with tear gas and stormed through the door. Crowley, bleeding, half-conscious, and surrounded by broken glass and empty shells, was dragged out. Helen Walsh was unharmed. The officers didn't kill him on the spot, though many believed they would. Instead, they arrested him, ending the manhunt not with his death, but with a spectacle that only deepened his myth. Crowley's trial was swift. Charged with multiple murders, including the killing of Officer Hirsch, he showed little remorse in court. At times, he appeared calm, almost defiant. He was 19, barely old enough to be considered a man, but already responsible for a trail of bodies and a city held hostage by his actions. The jury took little time. He was found guilty and sentenced to die in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. In the weeks that followed, the same newspapers that had glorified his crimes now printed his countdown to execution. Reporters speculated on his final words, his final meals, even whether he would cry. He didn't. On the day of his execution, January 21, 1932, Crowley wrote a note. "Under my coat is a weary heart," he scribbled. "But a kind one that would do nobody any harm." Whether it was sincere, ironic, or a final attempt to control the story, no one could say. He was walked to the electric chair just after midnight. Witnesses said he sat calmly, almost like he was still posing for the newspapers. A few minutes later, he was gone. Dead at 19. Francis "Two Gun" Crowley was not a criminal mastermind. He had no gang, no long-term plan. He was a violent boy in love with chaos, addicted to attention, and convinced that his youth made him untouchable. In the end, he wasn't. But for a brief, bloody chapter in 1931, he held a city in the palm of his hand and became a legend, one built not on brilliance, but on raw defiance, speed, and firepower. He died young, but his story burned itself into the American memory. Not as a hero, but as a warning.